Good morning, everyone. My name is Tim Kanagita. I am the coordinator of the New South Wales Active MedTech community, and would like to welcome everyone here today to our webinar, which will be on the subject of funding and finance and venture capital. Just before we start, I just want to give a quick plug to our sponsors, Genesis Electronics Design and CircuitWise Electronics Manufacturing. You can see their websites on the screen there, and I encourage you to go along and have a look at what they do. Genesis is just like to introduce today Callum Bir, who is the CEO of Strategicon Health and AI Ventures. Callum's got a long history in the field of, in the health sector. We were just talking about, he's stopped counting how many years he's been involved in the health industry. And his most recent sort of passion, I guess, is around artificial intelligence, but again, focused on the health sector. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from you today. Over to you, Callum.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you so much for welcoming for your event. A little bit about myself. I'll tell you a little bit of a story of how I got involved far much more intimately in ventures. As Tim was saying, I've spent around about 20 years, and I stopped counting after 20 in healthcare. And what I've been around the technology sector of MedTech. I've been involved in pharma quite a fair bit in the early days. I'd say my first 10 years, I've been involved in pharmaceutical companies, most in the pharma sector worldwide, from R&D all the way to sales marketing, very little in manufacturing. And then I moved on to work in public health, into hospitals, into hospital technologies, health technologies. I've been with consulting firms like Deloitte and McCann. And it was really only till I was at Microsoft worldwide, part of the worldwide health team, where I started getting involved into startups in particular. So I've been involved with startups probably, I'd say, for about 6-7 years now. And it was really to Microsoft where we started to look at how do we invest into early stage startups in MedTech in particular. So the bit of a story there is that it was not till, and we were looking at using technology to enable that. And it was till 2017, and I've been traveling. I spent a fair bit of time in the US, and I was in San Francisco 2017, January, and I remember the day really well, is when I got a chance to meet with Mr. Vinod Khosla from Khosla Ventures, founder, CEO of Khosla Ventures. And for some of you who sort of grew up around the time that I did, Mr. Khosla was, is the co-founder of Sun Microsystems, if you remember, which sort of in the 90s at some point was the foundation to the browser and a massive foundation to the internet. So I've always sort of held deep respect for him, but it's really through the type of work that he's doing, particularly investing primarily into MedTech. MedTech represents health tech, MedTech, or health in general represents one of the biggest investment category for Khosla Ventures. It was not till I had a chance to meet with him, at a health event that sort of got me really excited about formulating our own fund, which is Strategicon Health. So that's where I left Microsoft, set up our own fund, and we then started to invest ourselves, our own capital, as opposed to other people's capital, into early stage health tech companies in the US. So we have a number of companies in the US. We had invested into a number of companies out of Australia and Southeast Asia. One of the companies we invested in was circa of about $1 million into a company that was developing a handheld device and a wearable device that would identify and use devices, as well as use artificial intelligence algorithms to then classify, categorize, and understand the ECG data, as well as PPG data, to essentially diagnose and understand things like the narrowing of arteries or ventriculation, like basically the blood flows in particular, and understanding what the impact of that is, and understand individuals that may be precursors to a heart attack or stroke and things like that. So we've been investing in that, since 2017. We built a portfolio of about 8 companies, mostly in the US and in Southeast Asia, and then started looking at some of the companies in the US, in Australia as well. And with AI Ventures, we're now looking at primarily health as one of the top 3 categories besides climate and transport, to sort of look at how do we now not only just look at more traditional health startups and early stage companies that we could be investing in, but also looking at how do we also participate in some of the new categories of capabilities that is coming out, which is applying artificial intelligence, particularly to solve health problems, or industries like that are important. So that's how I got into the directly investing into companies using our own money as opposed to other people's money. What I wanted to talk about, and this is a discussion Tim and I had, was how do we get started? And this is a common area that a lot of early stage companies that we reach out to talk to us about, which is how do I get started? What are my pathways to get started? And I think about startups in 3 different categories, or at least from a venture capital standpoint. The first category is companies that have great ideas, or they might have great ideas and they might have some prototypes, they might have an MVP, but essentially anything pre-MVP, essentially. For all practical purposes, particularly in health tech, it is quite highly likely that unless you have an MVP, you don't have customers. You may have agreements or you may have memorandums of understandings with customers, but essentially there is no product per se at this stage. And certainly there are no revenues in the books at this point. And I think about those companies as companies that are in the incubation stage, right? And the second category are startup companies, early stage companies that have, let's just say, an existing MVP. They would have maybe 1 customer signed up. They might have done one pilot or a number of pilots with a number of customers. So there is one company that we're working with at the moment out in Australia. They have a specific capability in health to diagnose a specific medical condition using hardware and software. And at this point, they have probably they have 1 customer, which is the US military in particular. And now they use that existing pilot that they've done with the US military now into ADF, Australian Defence Force. So that's an example where, there's sort of companies that have some traction, I'd say. And now, they're sort of looking to sort of accelerate where they are with sales, and they're looking to accelerate, they're looking to now flesh out the product a bit more and sort of start building partnerships to start addressing the bigger problem as opposed to just, go beyond that prototype phase and MVP phase, right? And
can I just ask a question there? With these companies, incubation phase, or the different sizes they come in, to what extent do you go out and look for companies, and to what extent do they come knocking on your door? Is there a sort of and which ones, I guess, are the most successful for you?
Right, that's a great question, team. From a venture capital standpoint, it's always great to be able to invest into, from a VC point of view, ideally, most people that reach out to us tend to be companies in that acceleration phase, right? They tend to be an acceleration stage. They tend to be companies that have approved, that sort of have a bit of attraction and they're a bit more savvy, and they're the ones that reach out to us. We do get quite a fair amount of companies that reach out to us in that incubation phase, but I kind of feel like not enough. That's not the mainstream. That's not the mainstream. In terms of the ones we want to reach out to from a VC point of view, and I see us as a slightly different category of VCs, and I'll talk about the different categories of VCs in a moment. But the ones, most VCs I know now that are highly specialized are now looking to move early stage, which is how does more VCs get involved in some capacity, some shape or form up in the incubation phase, not necessarily providing capital to companies in the incubation phase, maybe providing some capital, but start to see how can we start shaping them, involving them, molding them in a way that will become more investable and attractive for us as an investor to those deals.
So are you talking about just giving companies advice?
Advice would be one that we would look at doing. We might provide some type of a agreements of sort that allows us to lock us in some way without us committing. So it could be a non-committal term sheet. We might start to negotiate certain terms that may be non-binding in nature. We might start potentially, and we have done that as well, even solicit some pre-due diligences as well. So obviously this is not a full technical due diligence per se, but these things could be types of things we would do to then give us a leg up, and it also gives us a bit of a tenure as well. And it might also be just building relationships with the founders and other investors that they may have had, because at the end of the day, the longer the relationships are, the more we understand about the company, the more we get to understand the trajectory, because in health, things don't move very fast, right? Like there needs to be a fair amount of time involved. And so the more we get involved, the more we understand the progression, the more confident we all feel about that specific investment category.
Okay, well, thank you. And yeah, please do finish this slide.
Yeah, look, and I think scale-ups is sort of where, companies have traction, they've got 3 clients, 4 clients, or specific, or they may have one specific, they might, if there are 10 top customers they want to target, let's just say in Australia, like in health, you think, well, we've got New South Wales Health, or we've got, one area in New South Wales Health, and we've got one something in Victoria happening. Now, how do we make that national, or how do we grow from one area, and how do we become mainstream, or how do we take something from, one site in America to 5 sites in Australia? How do we take that global, right? Or how do we take it into America? And now we're looking at a pure scale up. This is where the technology is relatively established. I won't say established, but it's still a startup, but we're solving very different types of a problem, right? Now, the funding pathways for these are very, very different in these 3 categories. The first is incubation. So there are a whole wide range of incubators you will find in Australia. Now, most incubators, there are no shortages of incubators. I think the last time we checked, there's probably around about, and I'm sort of averaging here, there's approximately about 50 incubators and accelerators, at least in New South Wales alone, right?
Yeah, it's quite staggering, because when you first enter this field, everyone hears about Cicada, which is probably one of the most famous ones, and it's got good linkages into government. But the longer you're in the health field, the more you come across these incubators that are being funded and supported in a number of ways. Like virtually every university has its own incubator, and there's more in all sorts of different ways of being set up.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, Tim. And I think I think part of that is, once upon a time, it was very fashionable to have lots of incubators, and that was obviously encouraged by the Australian federal government in particular, where they announced a $500,000 grant for essentially becoming an incubator. So anybody who could become an incubator and had any background in incubation effectively took that money and did it. Now, what I see happening though is a massive change, because many of the incubators have had a 2-year grant period, and over the next 12 months or so, a lot of them will be running out of the grant money, right? And so I would not be surprised, and look, don't count me on it, Tim, we'll see if something changes, but I would not be surprised if many will start to disappear as the funding runs out, unless somehow there is some additional federal funding that comes up to continue that. But and also, the funding had gone from $500,000 for incubation grant down to less than around about half of that. And the criteria has significantly been uplifted. So I feel like a lot of them would not necessarily re-qualify to be able to do that. So I think whilst there are a lot of incubators, number one, from MedTech point of view and health tech point of view in general, health in general, there's just not enough. I mean, Cicada is doing a great job, I think, to a certain extent, being very, very niche and dedicated to that. And you know, there are a number of really advanced ones in Victoria, like the MedTech actuator. There are quite a number of them, and there is also the MedTech incubators and incubators in particular that are set up by large MedTech companies like Johnson and Johnson, J&J, and there are a number of corporate ones as well. And I'll talk a bit more about it. But essentially, there are a lot of incubators out there in the marketplace, so it's almost hard to understand how to pick one, you know, but what to do, right? But a lot of incubators are really out there to kind of find a way to trade equity. Often a lot of the incubators might take, you know, something like, because a lot of the startups at this point do not have a lot of capital, do not have a lot of cash. And so quite often, many of the incubators, a lot of the incubators that are non-government funded tend to trade equity, you know, for a lot of the incubation services. They tend to run as a program from between anywhere from 3 months to 6 months. And again, you know, I think when I look at MedTech in particular, why this is so unique and different, there is not a lot that can be achieved in a 6 weeks, 12-week type of an incubation program, right? You know, if you're a mobile app or something like that, maybe that is very highly likely that somebody can go through a whole life cycle within 6 weeks or 12 weeks, and come at the end of the day, at the end of 12 weeks, a prototype, right? That can be tried and tested with customers in a growth hacking sort of an environment. But that tends to not happen as much in the health space. And therefore, I think, you know, the further the need for having something that's very health specific and unique to health. I've set up about 6 incubators across in Australia and in the US and in Asia, specifically to health. And I can sort of give you a sense of what are the challenges in setting one up. You know, and we had to like pretty much rethink, you know, how to set them up relative and how that to be different to, you know, your classical ones that are more B2C oriented, for instance.
I think we'll have to have another whole webinar on this subject. But we better move on to talk about venture capital a bit. So
I guess the question there would be, you know, as you're thinking about as a MedTech company and a startup, as to, you know, how do you pick one up? And so the first advice I tend to talk about is start with an exit in mind, right? So for example, one of the MedTech companies that we're currently advising on, you know, we're looking at an investment, but we played an advisory role. They've got a MedTech technology, and we looked at Novartis as a potential partner for that. And, you know, we're involved in working together with Novartis's incubation acceleration program in the US, you know, to sort of match them up and to see whether that's a right partner or not. That's where the reason for picking that as a incubation partner was essentially because of the exit strategy. The exit strategy for that specific company, Sydney-based, Australian-based company, was that, you know, Novartis would potentially be a great acquisition target for that specific company. And so with that exit in mind, it became far more obvious that working with a Novartis in particular would be a potential option. There's another startup out of Sydney that we're working with, where, you know, we're sort of working with Johnson & Johnson in particular. And for that, we've identified a different geography. And for another company, we're working with Allianz, which is a health insurance company out in Singapore. So again, it really comes down to what the exit is, what the exit strategy is. And based on the exit, we would then find the right partner, and I think would be the right partner to work with from a, you know, from incubation, acceleration, or scale up relative to the the business as well. And I think that sort of, Tim, gets me to the related topic that we talked about, which is the different funding sources that are available relative to the types of the stages of the business. The very first stage is the bootstrap companies that have put the personal capital, founders have put personal capital, essentially not earning a salary, digging deep into their savings or otherwise, and trying to get to a point where you've got a concept, or you've got a product, or you've got an MVP of some sort. There are certainly some grant monies available to do that, but those grant monies are typically fairly limited, such as the $25,000 MVP grant in New South Wales, and other states have slightly different dollar value for that. And there are a number of programs that are out there to be able to access those types of grants. And the next stage typically is sort of, the seed stage, where, there is something in there. Look, I think if you'd asked me 5, 6, maybe even 10 years ago, I would think that a lot of the seed investors were investing in ideas. And I feel the market in Australia in particular has changed, and certainly has changed in America for sure. But it's also changing in Australia, where because there are more startups now, there are more opportunities to invest in early stage companies. I think the criteria has shifted such that a lot of the individual investors, whether they're friends or families, or I hate the word fools, which is the other F, tend to invest in, right? But this is sort of where typically the category of people who would invest in that would be somewhere, folks like high net worth individuals. They have some savings. Not to say that if probably more loosely speaking, high net worth individuals, because I have seen people invest, sums of, $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 from savings as well. That may not necessarily be high net worth individuals, but typically it's those that have a significantly high disposable income that tend to invest as seed investors or angel investors per se. There are a number of venture capitalists, institutional capitalists, that are now starting to move into the early stage VCs. They're far and few. I have not seen too many of that. Whilst I think that's a fantasy to a certain end, and I see a lot of narrative coming up, but in terms of actual execution and real proof points, I haven't seen enough of that. But I think with what's happening at the moment with Corona and everything else, I feel like more venture capitalists would be moving more early stage and investing in this category. So this is one area I'd say, let's stay tuned. Corporate ventures, that's a huge part. A lot of the corporate ventures are trying to get very early. So corporate ventures would be your pretty much all the big MedTech company today, whether it's Medtronic, J&J, you name it, or big pharma in particular, or the groups like a Johnson & Johnson between MedTech and pharma, etc. They combine all of that, and they have their own corporate venture arm, and they would invest not necessarily capital at early stage, but look at taking a stake potentially in some of these assets, some of these companies at early stage, as early as possible, right? So that they can integrate that into the pipeline, to integrate that into their into the systems. And the second section is, and I see a massive disconnect between seed investments. Seed investments in Australia, I see is changing from, I think a couple of $100,000 used to be what people go for, but these days I see a lot more companies are moving up the scale up to the mark of about $1 million and onwards at that seed level. There's one MedTech company we're working with at the moment that's raising about $5 million for seed. So look, I think the numbers are, the increasing. But I think
can I ask Callum, because
yeah, sure.
you're going to be talking about Series A in a moment. Is there a difference between seed and the next tranche of funding other than the quantum of dollars? Is there sort of like different contractual arrangements, or I'm just preempting your discussion of Series A?
Yeah, I think I think the single biggest difference is institutional capital versus non-institutional capital. That tends to be, in my view, sort of the single biggest differentiator, because a lot of the institutional capital, when I say institutional, this could be financial institutions, this could be, so think about the likes of SoftBank, think about, you know, the large venture capital houses, or Khosla Ventures as an example, or even AI Ventures, which is the other venture we have, or our ventures. A lot of venture capitalists are relatively risk averse in a sense that, yes, you know, they would want something that's tried and, you know, somewhat tried, as opposed to something that has zero customer record. And it leads to some discussions I want to have later on around valuation. Valuation is a key component to that. So if you aren't able to use institutional methods to evaluate a company, it becomes very hard to invest from a financial institutional point of view. So I think the source of funds tend to be, in my view, one of the largest. And also I think the cost of acquisition. The reality is a lot of the large institutional investors, you know, it costs somewhere between, like I give you our examples, it costs somewhere between $30,000 to $50,000 to do a due diligence per deal. And we do that in a very nimble sort of a way, very, very nimble sort of a way, right? You know, if you're a larger institution, then the cost of a due diligence as part of a transaction could cost $50,000 or more. Now, if it does cost that sort of money, you would not do that for a transaction size that would be just, you know, if it was a $50,000 investment, you wouldn't do that, right? But if I'm investing $100,000, I wouldn't spend $50,000 in due diligence. I would probably just take the risk. But if I'm investing $5, $10, $20, $30 million, I would invest a significantly more part of my the investment into doing due diligence. So that limits the number of deals that venture capitalists can participate in. And therefore, as a result of that, the volume is low, the quantum is high, the volume is low, the number of transactions you can physically do in a year is quite low. You have a much larger investment committee. And as a result of that, you know, there are many layers of decision making as well. So there's a whole wide range of things that differentiate, as opposed to, you know, having non-institutional investors that would invest based on how they feel, or based on relationships, or based on, you know, their propensity to take higher levels of risk. And it's the gap in between that sort of seed and Series A, which is where most of the startups fail, right? And that's sort of, you know, I don't see much issues, at least from a VC point of view. I do not see many companies struggle to go from an MVP to get seed round. Most companies I see fail is they challenge them, you know, they struggle to kind of go from that first raise to the second raise, and the transition from, you know, individual investors to institutional investors. That's where I see the single largest challenge. Once people have institutional capital, it's almost like you're in the mainstream, and getting to B and C and D and so forth, that becomes almost mechanical, right? Because now you have the funding, you've got the people on board, you might have institutions that will help you to raise the second and third round.
Can I ask a question there? You mentioned early on at the early stages that the incubators, you know, will offer their services in return for a bit of equity. Typically, what is the deal that is done with these larger tranches of money in the Series A and B? What are they expecting in return for their money?
Right. So in terms of expectation for returns, you know, I think that's a great question. Let me save that question, team, on that.
Yeah, sure.
But in terms of the risk and reward, I think it's sort of, but let's talk about percentages. I think percentages is probably far much more accurate. I think it's more about, you know, if the company is very, very early stage, you would have people that would take a much significant higher amount of, you know, number of shares or percentages of shares into the company, right? So let's just say, you know, if the technology doesn't exist, if the capability doesn't exist, the business plan isn't even clear, it is possible that the first round of investors might take significant amount of stake into the company. Whereas as you get into Series A and so forth, at this point, the company's valuation is significantly higher, and there is some proof points as well. The valuations are higher, and as a result of that, you take, you know, the number of shares available is relatively low. So companies would take, you know, at this point, institutions may take around 5, 10, probably not more than 15% of the company. Now, obviously that varies quite significantly, right? It varies very, very significantly from investor to investor, company to company, but that's sort of generally the, you know, the sort of metric that I'd be looking at. But Tim, I think that's a good segue into talking about valuations. So I think from an investor point of view, a lot of the time it comes down to the valuation, right? So, and this is one I think startups struggle with, and not just the startups, also venture capitalists struggle with as well, right? Which is coming up to an agreement on what is the value of your company. So it's not so much that the capital isn't available, it's more about how much, you know, what is that capital buying, right? So if some, you know, for example, I mean, you know, you might have a founder that might have a self-assessed valuation, let's just say for $1 million, right? Of, you know, the value of the company is supposedly $1 million, and they're looking to raise 100K, and this is just for illustration. If the valuation is 1 mil and they're raising 100K of capital, then that company is diluting only 10% of the shares for $1 mil. You know, but if the company is only looking to raise 100K, but if the valuation is 10 mil, right, they're only getting 1% as opposed to 10% of the company, right? And if it's 100 mil worth company, you're getting 0.1% of the company. So from an investor standpoint, it's a combination of valuation. Can we agree on what's the right valuation, and can we get a discount on the valuation? But more importantly, it's how does that pertains to the return. And when I say return, most investors typically, unlike perhaps say individual stock investors, for instance, a lot of the venture capitalists would not, and especially for early stage companies, it's not about dividends. It's almost all the time that I know, it's not about dividends, it's about capital gains, right? The types of capital gains, you know, an early stage VC would be looking at would be at the very minimum 6x. And that typically is in about 3 years' time, right? That's sort of a bit of a rule of thumb. So if you had spare cash lying around, you know, other than putting money in fixed deposit, you could buy bonds and a whole bunch of stuff, you'd get 6% roughly, right? Or thereabouts, but in single digits. And that was the point of that. But the idea is, at the absolute very least, you need to be getting 6x return in 3 years' time. Now, in some cases in health tech, that could be a much longer tenure. The returns in health tends to be much higher than 6x, but the tenure is much longer. And this tenure can go on from 5 to 10 years and sometimes longer, right? And the longer obviously it goes on for, then you're looking at 60x or maybe even 100x, right? But the failure rate is high, so the amount of capital dispersed is relatively low, and so it's more about diversifying your portfolio, as opposed to, you know, the more classical investments. Tim, did you have any points on this that you wanted to ask as well, or anyone else?
Well, I'm just interested in the comment when you said that MedTech tends to be much longer return timeframes than other kinds of industry sectors. I'm just interested in where you see where that's coming from.
Yeah, look, I think there are a couple of different things. So when we're looking at the return ratios and expectation of MedTech being different, it goes back to the valuation. And so let's look at what drives the valuation then. There are a number of methods of valuating, right? But one of the, from a more financial point of view of valuation is often linked with revenues, right? And one of the challenges many of the MedTech companies tend to have in general barring maybe some software companies or pure software companies, is that health sales tends to have very long sales cycle. And they tend to be very B2B centered, and they tend to have very long sales cycles. And these sales cycles can take years. And many of these large transactions, so let's just say in the US, for example, if you're trying to win Kaiser Permanente as one group, or any of the top 10 health systems in the US, or even in Australia as well, these sales cycles can take years. Before you go through the demonstration process, you go through, and then you may be caught up in procurement, right? Companies may be caught up in procurement, and so there aren't real revenues in the books. Secondly, there may be regulatory challenges and regulatory barriers that may slow things down. Now, depending on the class of products it is and whatnot, that could take time as well. And there may be a whole wide range of things that are unique to health that a consumer startup as a comparison would not have. And therefore that significantly affects revenue. And as an investor, fundamentally it's about things that move the valuation of the company, right? And we understand health, the opportunity there is that the barrier of entry is high, but that's also the challenge. Because the barrier of entry into a market is high, you have to look at each market propensity. It's almost like you got to do market by market analysis as well, to look at your risk opportunity, but also from your valuation point of view. Valuations does not tick up. It's not like a Uber or something like that where, well, if the product is about that, then that's great. But a lot of the MedTech regulated products in particular, or services, do not tick up based on the number of downloads, right? And as a result of that, it's harder to increase your valuation quite substantially, and therefore, and also I think the last thing I think of is the category of large investors is relatively small in MedTech, and therefore, I think that's a slightly more conservative market as well. Unlike other sectors, you can trade private equity quite quickly. These transactions don't happen as quickly as you need to, so you're stuck with the valuation, right? So when the valuation does go up, it goes up quite significantly, but they just take time.
Sorry, thank you. I've got a question here from Liz Boyce at Denton's, and I just would encourage other people if they've got a question for Callum, as we go, very happy to ask them. So trying to make this a little bit conversational. Do type in your questions into the Q&A control panel. But Liz Boyce from Denton's asks, Callum, can you comment on what a VC will typically want in addition to a share of equity, e.g. board seats, veto rights, influence over exit strategy?
Right. Well, those are really great questions. I find that that would come down to the different class of a VC. So you talked about, the types of things that a VC would be asking for. I think the first way to think about would be what type of VC is it? Is it a corporate venture? Is it corporate or non-corporate? So if it's a corporate, so imagine if, a large MedTech or pharma takes interest in this, they obviously would want the first right of refusal, right? If you were to provide, so you're kind of locked in to those deals to a certain extent. There are certainly ways to get out of that, and that's helpful. But quite often, that's a condition that's often put in place. But if it's a classical independent VC from a large MedTech that doesn't have any direct influence or as such, then the types of things they'd be looking for, yes, there's certainly some VCs I see put a lot of controls over other VCs that you can invest in. We hate that. So in fact, I've come across a number of companies where we wanted to invest, and their prior investors had certain conditions that would prevent us from investing, because they wanted to have the rights of refusal for all investors. They wanted the investors wanted to know who other investors were, and they did not want competing investors. And that was a real bummer, because I would have certainly discouraged, if I were on their side, I would have discouraged them from signing an agreement like that right in the first place, because I thought that was stupid, in my opinion. Look, I think as far as board seats are concerned, I see a lot of that happening more for small VCs as opposed to large VCs. And the reality is that board seats are really there to gain a sense of control and to gain a certain level of access into the company. So I sort of almost go back to what is the level of trust that you have with the VC, and what is the level of maturity that they have as a VC. And you'll find that the more mature ones will ask less in terms of controls, and there will be other ways to put controls in place so that you would have, so for example, and look, I think for very early stage companies, like I remember we had one investment, and we had to put some very specific condition for a very, very early stage company we invested, where we had conditions like, any spend over a certain threshold would have to be approved, only because we felt that there were certain levels of risks associated to a certain startup. So those are just examples of certain conditions that a VC may put. But I feel a lot of that is to do with the levels of risk we see in a specific deal.
Okay, so I've got some more questions, but I see you've got one or two more slides. Did you want to quickly go through those, or shall we move into questions?
Look, we kind of talked about the horizons, LPs and sources of funds. So one of the areas that I often see that's a bit confusing sometimes is to think about how does a VC operate, and how does a VC work in the first place. So keep in mind, every VC is different. Every VC would have a different source of funds, but quite often you will have VCs that is not necessarily their own money, right? It's other people's money, right? So, and this is a bit of something that many early stage companies may not have privy to, which is asking questions around what are the sources of funds, and the sources of funds almost determine what is the risk appetite for that specific fund, right? And also the investors or the companies, the institutions that make up, the investors into the pool of funds that is there for investment, would fundamentally have to have a mandate, and the VC would have to internally within the organizations have to essentially sign off on a mandate, and that mandate would have to have a set of criteria, would have to have a set of requirements, the vision, the goal, and all of the different types of things, in addition to having an investment committee, an independent evaluation committee, and all of that, to ensure that there are safeguards put in place for the companies that they invest in, or at least typically that's how it works. There are some exceptions we see in the industry today, but generally that's how most of them work. If you find, for example, there are certain types of VCs that might have things like, there are a couple of VCs, for example, that I know that have sovereign funds, global VCs that have sovereign funds. This could be money from Singapore government, from Temasek funds, for example, that are very large investors in MedTech, for instance. And those are great, those can be sometimes very advantageous if you get involved with VCs, MedTech ones in particular, that have those types of sovereign funds, because not only you get capital, right, but you also get capital with relationships and other types of things that can sometimes be advantageous. So keep that in mind, that think about who the LPs are, what the sources of funds are, and how the different sources of funds with different LPs that make up a fund can give you other intrinsic benefits that may not be, that would be far beyond just the than the dollar itself. But also at the same time, there can be.
Can you remind the audience what an LP is?
Oh, sorry. LP is a limited partner. So these are the companies that ultimately pour in the money, right? So if you think about my fund with Strategic on Health, I've got a number of LPs. I'm an LP in the fund as well. And these are the people that have put in their capital to make up the fund. And so each of the people that have signed in to make up the fund are the ones that, you know, they form a key part of the investment decision into the mandate that we formulated.
Sure. And you were going to talk about the different types of VCs. I know you've sort of alluded to it already, but to make it sort of clear, are you able to sort of, in a way, categorize what the different types of VCs are?
Yeah, look, I think, you know, there are different types of VCs, and it's probably unfair to go through an academic sense of that. But in general, I think about the corporate VCs, you know, that kind of make up your big pharma, big tech, there are a couple of smaller ones as well. But almost every MedTech pharma today, you know, and I think health insurance companies as well, and health systems in the US in particular, they all now have their own venture capital arm. And those are very interesting, I feel, for health tech in particular, or MedTech in general. That's one category at a very, very macro view of the world. The second would be financial institutions, right? Where, you know, these are just your, you know, your classical banks effectively, right? These are your money pots that are now looking at early stage startups as just another asset class. And they tend to be very financially oriented. You know, so instead of investing into, you know, properties or large capital assets, they would have one category, you know, into high risk funds, and that would then subsequently invest into that. But at the end of the day, they tend to be very hands-off. They tend to be very non-strategic, but sometimes can be, you know, a good complement to other VCs that you might have. You might find strategic investors. Strategic investors tend to be active VCs that would be directly involved in your business. That can be a good thing or a bad thing depending on what that business needs. An active VC would play a huge role in the business. And they're the guys who sort of behave a bit like a private equity. And a lot of private equity tends to be more for scale-ups. And private equity typically are the guys that, you know, would be, you know, coming out of family offices, one family office or a number of family offices working together to invest into a specific asset class. Either they would make up a VC, either they would act as a VC, or they would be pure private equity that would work with other VCs as an LP to then invest into those specific securities.
Sure. One thing that's going through my mind, you just rattled off, like, if you think about the number of corporates, insurance companies around the world, there must be hundreds and hundreds of sources of venture capital. You know, how does a small startup in Australia, it might be a surgeon with a fantastic idea, they might even have their MVP, but there's so many of these companies, you know, just how do you even start? How do you know who to approach? Which are the best VCs to try and approach? How do you even just knock on their door? Because in my experience, if you send an email to their inbox, they tend to get ignored. And I guess once you do, you know, what kind of questions should we ask them to make sure that they're the right one fit for you? Yeah,
look, I think that continues to be a massive challenge I see into the market. And quite often there's probably a lot of individuals out. I think there is a lot of, I think step number one, I think, you know, there's a lot of people who supposedly claim themselves as a consultant or an advisor. If you get somebody who, you know, is happy to work with you and help you through navigate all of that, either for cash or for equity. That tends to be one approach. I feel that's a bit of a hit and a miss. And sometimes you'll find, ex-VCs who are now turned into ex-bankers who've now turned into consultants and advisors. There tend to be one category of people that sometimes help. Again, a bit of a hit and a miss. The incubators and accelerators are trying to do that now. So they're trying to collate and aggregate all those types of resources, pre-screen, pre-qualify, and almost vet the people that they trust and build a community of those. And accelerators, incubators tend to, a lot of the ones that tend to do a reasonable job at that. The government is trying to do some of that, through, again, this is being recorded, so I probably won't say very much about my opinion on that, Tim. But look, that's an area of improvement, and I've got a lot of opinion about how that can be helped. We're trying to do some of that as well through our VC, and that's almost why we've looked at putting part of the work we do in our spare capacity to provide a lot of free advice. So when we're launching AI Ventures and Strategic on Health, we recognized that we'd had to invest a fair bit of our time, not just in the transactions and active management of portfolio. We had to, as part of what we do, had to be a lot of advisory work as well. So we do some of that. But look, that's a massive gap, Tim. I'd love to get your ideas and
it's
the
part
work
of
you're
what
doing
this
is great.
Community is all about. But once we've got through this initial education phase in our webinars, we're going to be looking at subjects like that to say, look, what are the barriers, what are the issues for our industry, and what can we do about it? But look, I've got a few questions coming in, so I'll just address those now. I've got Luke, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I think it's Wiesent or Wiesent Sai. So he's asking the question, does team composition / board affect the valuation of the startup, and if so, how?
Right. Well, I think there is a technical answer to that, and there is a non-technical answer to that. From a technical point of view, and I'm just saying purely from a financial technical point of view, no. Right? I'm just saying purely from a numerical point of view, no. But what I would say though is, whilst it doesn't necessarily play, it doesn't directly move the needle as far as the valuation is concerned. What it does though, I think, does play a massive role in with the negotiations to the valuation or defending that valuation. And if somebody is asking for a massive discount to that, then you would have a bit more ground. The solid the team is, and especially if the team is irreplaceable, right? And not one individual, but the collection of the composition of the team. If that's irreplaceable, and if that is something that is absolutely necessary, and that's what's needed, then that would carry a lot of weight, not directly on the valuation, but how you would go and defend that valuation.
Okay, another question is, if you're an early stage company dealing with a VC, what would you expect to see in a term sheet? And that's again from Liz Boyce from Dentons.
Right. Well, if it's an early stage, well, I think there is two things. Well, first of all, if you're a very early stage, you're pre-revenue, the first question is, there aren't too many VCs that play in early stage. So that's the very, very first part of it, right? But if you were to see things in the term sheets, you would find, a lot more controls, a huge amount of control, whether it's executable or not. You would see a lot of control in spend, right? It's almost like it's almost like you'll have to have operational controls, financial operational controls over that. I see that to be probably the single largest part of the term sheet. The second category of term sheets you'd expect would be milestone-based investment. So I see that a lot actually for a very early stage in particular, where people will say, okay, let's agree. Let me give you an example. So I saw what I've been involved where one of the companies we had invested and we were going for a second round of investment. We had somebody coming at 10 million, but that 10 million was subjected to achieving certain milestones. And, we had to then look at, whether or not those milestones were realistic. And it wasn't just milestones, those milestones were also time bound as well, right? So that's an example of something you'd have to look at in a lot of detail instead of it was easy to say yes. Yes, somebody willing to put 10 mil on the table was fantastic, right? But the question is, are the milestones achievable, and does it even mean anything? So those are the two that I can think of top of my head at the moment. But if you ask me again, I'm happy to reach out and think about a couple of more that I see a bit more.
Sorry, last question from Liz Boyce, and I'll mention Liz again in a minute because she is giving one of our next webinars coming up. Is what key homework should an early stage company do before engaging with the VC in order to present a compelling narrative to the VC?
Right. Look, that's a great question. Look, the more homework you do about the VC, the better it is. And even as part of your homework, I encourage all potential investment seekers to ask lots of questions to VC even before that meeting. The first one would be, what is the investment? What is the mandate, right? Ask the mandate, understand the mandate, understand what the criteria are. That's the first thing, I think, to just make sure you're not wasting time. Secondly, understand, as I mentioned before, who are the LPs and what other things that they may be interested in. That may not necessarily be easily available. So certainly ask, and I'd say understanding that would be helpful. The third one would be understand what has been the history of companies they've invested in. And certainly, if possible, go and talk to founders of the companies that have invested and find out if, what the experiences are. I can tell you from my experience, when I have had conversations with founders about certain VCs, they tell me massive horror stories. They'll be like, oh my God, I can't wait to get rid of that VC. If I can just find somebody to buy them out, right? I would, so absolutely go and talk to them and see if, they have a good or bad history of having VCs, because certain money may not be good money, it can be more toxic. And, I think you find a lot of early investors struggle with that. Look, I think those would be the top three. I think there's probably a much more comprehensive list, but those are the ones that come to my mind yet.
Okay, I want to ask you a couple. So just continuing that question that we had, and we'll take another 5 minutes, I think. When you have made your pitch to the VC, how do you know, what is the process by which decisions are actually made? Like, who are the decision makers? Are they the people you're talking to? Who are the different people you talk to? And if you don't hear back from them, what do you do?
Right. Wow, that's a huge question, team. Let me try and see if I can address that in a couple of minutes. I think the first thing is, quite often, the first levels of presentations tend to be done to finance analysts. And again, the titles may vary company to company, but they're your screeners, right? They're the guys who tend to do the screening for the first round. It's almost like just making sure that first pitch would be typically your assessments of sorts. Now, obviously, there are technologies now available like Gust and various other things where, that's significantly lowering the number of processes, significantly reducing the burden on those first or 2 levels of pitches. But the first exercise tends to be more about ticking in the boxes to make sure that it meets the investment mandate. Or even it's the right stage, you know, do they have all the things necessary? Is this ready or not? So that's the first stage. And, you know, quite often it's not the decision makers, it's just the finance analyst. They do have a significant amount of influence into the process, but that's not typically decision making. So you typically would have to go through a number of rounds of those pitch to get to ultimately the GP, the general partner, involved in the actual decision making, or at least key part of the decision making. So, you know, that's almost where, if you're getting to that stage, then you know you're qualified, right? And then every deal will be put to an investment committee, which needs to be an independent committee, and that committee will ultimately decide. So that's where the initial, that's where the process starts almost. It's almost where you get pre-qualified to go into the committee, is where it starts. Most people don't get to that point, right? And once you're in the committee, then that's where you'll start to see paperwork coming through. But until you're seeing those paperwork coming through, you know, it's not a, you know, the chances of at this point is very low. So I feel like it is quite an elaborate process. Obviously every VC operates a little differently. The smaller ones would be more nimble. But even if they are nimble, you'll find that, you know, you'll have more hurdles down the road. And the ones that take more time and they're asking you more questions right up front, they're doing more screening like type questions, then that would mean the decision making at the back end will be lower as well. And everyone operates slightly differently, Tim.
Yeah. How long does this whole process normally take?
Oh, how long is a piece of string? But I think, you know, I think I've seen people, I've heard of people that claim that they've been able to get funding from a VC between 3 to 6 months. But I don't see that, in my personal observation, I don't see that as to be the norm. I see that to be the exception as to the norm. And look, there may be others in this, you know, in this forum here that may have different experiences. You know, but I think typically this could take anywhere between 6 months to 12 months at a minimum. And we're talking about after all the preparation is done. Like, you know, if something is highly investable and you have all the checks, all the ticks, you've got a clear investment plan, you know exactly what VCs you're going to be going after. You've mapped them out, you scoped it out, you know where you'll go, what your strategy is. Is this an Australia specific raise or is it raise for America? And you've got all of those different answers to all the questions. If you've got all of those things planned, the planning itself can take 3 to 6 months at a minimum, right? And if there are things that you have to, you know, do to get window dressing done, you know, agreements that may have been, there may be agreements that there may be understandings that you have that may not be an agreement, and that can take some time to sort out. So just cleaning up the house, effectively doing window dressing, getting prepared up for a raise, that itself can take 3 to 6 months, right? And then the actual process of raise, that could take, you know, 3 to 6 months at an absolute minimum. Look, there are success stories and I hear them and I go, wow, fantastic, that's great. But I don't see that to be the norm.